Hi everyone, it's Angela from Happy Dotting Company. Today I'm going to be doing a beginner's video. I have had a beginner's video for a long time, but whilst the content was still good, I really felt that it needed updating. Some products of ours have changed, and I also wanted to add more information about paint and such. So what I'm going to be doing is essentially teaching this like I would if I was teaching it in person. So we're going to be talking about the tools that we use. I'm going to be talking about canvas. I'm going to be talking about the paint. And I'm going to be talking about, most importantly, technique, so that if you're wanting to, explore this art and try it out, then, you will have a good base and some confidence to start and actually, understand how to get good results. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that I'm going to be teaching this class with just the basic set of dotting tools that we have at Happy Dotting Company. And the reason for that is that these are the tools that actually come in our beginner kit, along with instructions, comes in the kit along with a stencil. And we also provide some practice cards and things like this, which just makes it a nice easy start for people. And what I'm going to do is write up this pattern that I'm going to be demonstrating today, but I'm also going to be writing it up so that you can also use our superset of dotting tools, which are these ones. They're available, all these products actually are available on our website. You can also find us on Etsy, and if you're in America, then Amazon as well. So these dotting tools are very, very popular with people that do get into this art. As you can see, they've got the numbers clearly marked there, which makes it really easy to follow patterns. And they're nice and, nice to hold because they've got this ergonomic shape. And anyway, very, very popular. People absolutely love them and rave about them. But I'm going to be teaching this particular class with these basic set of dotting tools, and because they're the ones that come in our dotting kit. So one of the first things I'm going to talk about now is paint. Now, paint is one of the obviously essential elements to doing mandala dot art, and working out what the best paint to use can be the first challenge. I've done lots of trial and errors with different paints, and I've also been part of the Dot Mandala community, pretty much since its inception nearly 10 years ago. So, what we've found is that basically one of the most popular brands of paint is actually Deco Art Americana. So these are the ones here. If you're lucky in the USA, then you can get these at Hobby Lobby and at Michael's and various places online from Deco Art themselves. In Australia, they're available from Spotlight and easily available online. At Happy Dotting Company, we're going to be stocking them as well. And also, in other countries like Canada and UK, elsewhere, then you really probably just need to Google online where you can find this brand of paint. Now, what's great about this paint is that they have a wonderful colour range. There's sort of over 200 colours available. However, it is a craft paint, so it's not the best quality paint that you could possibly find. But what makes it really ideal is the consistency. The consistency is perfect straight from the bottle, and that is really the hardest thing to get right when you're starting. So I'll show you what I mean by the right consistency, but I also just want to mention a few other paints. Now, what the paint consistency that we're aiming for is basically like egg yolk. So I'll show you what I mean here. So today we're going to be using 3 shades of purple, just basically because these are my favourite colours. And then we're going to be using 2 shades of sort of like a turquoise green type colour. Now, can you see that when I'm pouring this, there really isn't any peaks? In other words, it really is quite fluid. And that's really what we're aiming for. So if you can see peaks in your paint, it probably means that it's too thick and you will need to thin it down a bit. You can see that that one's just a fraction thicker, but really these are absolutely fine. And what I'm going to do is actually add just a little bit of white, just to tint it up a bit to this middle purple here. And the exact colours for these I will actually have in the pattern, by the way, so you don't really need to worry too much about knowing them at this moment. And I'm just, as I said, added a bit of white just to tint it up a bit, change it, just so there's a little bit more contrast between the two deeper purples. And can you see now that that's much better? And observe the consistency. See, it really wants to sort of, it's not like an ink, it's not fluid, but it doesn't want to arrive at a peak, and that's about perfect as is. Now, the thing is, you can thicken paint and you can thin paint. If you've got some medium-bodied paints that you want to use at home that obviously are just a bit thick, then you can thin them. And what we recommend to thin them is this product called a Liquitex medium. It's actually a pouring medium, and you just need to add just a touch of this. Just be careful, don't add too much. And you just stir it in, and that will make your paint a bit thinner. The other one that works quite well, I find, is actually just an airbrush medium. You can see that that's very, very thin. So when you add this to a thick paint, it makes it thinner. And just to sort of reiterate what I was saying initially, the consistency that we're aiming for is egg yolk. So you want it to have a little bit of body, a little bit of thickness, but not peaks, not like whipped cream that's going to have stiff peaks. And, you know, essentially sort of learning the perfect consistency when your paints initially aren't and you have to change them. It is just a matter of practice. You will see very quickly which paints produce a good result and which paints don't. Now, just to touch on other brands that I would recommend, in Australia, and I know this is available in America as well, we have Joe Sonja's Matte Flow Acrylics. They're pretty good. They're a very good quality paint. They've got high pigment. However, sometimes the consistency can be a little bit variable, so you might need to change the, how thin or thick they are. But they're also an excellent paint. Arteza is a very good brand, very good quality paint. However, again, you would probably need to thin it down. It's usually too thick. My favourite white is actually Golden Fluid Acrylics. Now, generally speaking, Golden Fluid Acrylics is a lot more expensive than, the Deco Art Americanas, but the quality is really fantastic, very high pigment. They rarely separate. That's one of the things with the cheaper paints, is that they can actually easily separate, and you need to be very careful about mixing them before you start. So there's lots of brands available. This one I actually recently found. It's very, very good, but it's, it comes in these bigger bottles. And one of the great things about Dot Mandala Art is that it's actually quite economical with paint. You don't use heaps of paint, so you rarely need to get big bottles. But essentially that's what we're aiming for, is a paint that's good quality, preferably more opaque rather than transparent. And you really want it to be that lovely sort of egg yolk consistency. Just wanted to add this bit of information in at the point of editing. I just thought I should also mention, with dot mandalas these days, a lot of people want to have, raised or puffy dots on their work, which is understandable because it looks fantastic. And some of the best artists, like Art of Points, you know, their work is a lot of puffy dots. But to be honest with you, it's not really a beginner technique because you have to use a much thicker paint, as in a medium-bodied paint, and very often you have to really work it and manipulate the dot to actually look like that. And much easier option is to actually use these Nuvo drops. There's some other sorts available. They're basically not a paint, it's more sort of a texture gel. So Nuvo drops, crystal drops, is a really great option. And how they work, actually, I'll do it on a bit of card here. How they work is that they sort of self-forming. So I'm just laying that down there. And you can see that essentially it stays raised, it doesn't spread. So it's like a gel, it's not really a paint. And the other thing you can do with these is you can manipulate them into shapes, but it does take a bit of practice. But you can see that it stays nice and raised and puffy. So these are very, very popular to use in Dot Mandala Art, and I just thought I should throw that in this video. Just one thing before I finish about paint that I forgot to mention is that, as you can see, I've got my paint sitting in this little, it's like a little silicone thing. We sell these silicone sheets of paint palettes at Happy Dotting Company. You can cut them up to the size that suits you. And I've got it sitting on a lid of like a container, and then this piece of kitchen paper here is wet. And then when I'm sort of halfway through some art, but I still want to keep my paints, I will actually put the lid on it like that, and the moisture in the wet kitchen towel there will actually keep it humid in there and stop my paints from drying out. Often people use little paint pots and such, and that's absolutely fine, but I do find them sort of a bit of a pain to be cleaning out all the time, whereas I find these quite easy to clean. You know, you just basically take the lid off, allow any remnants of paint to completely dry, and then you can just sort of pop them out into the bin. You don't really want to be putting washing paints down your sink per se. Apparently it's not good for the waterways. You might find little sort of specks of paint still on there that you can either rub off with your fingernail, or there's actually sort of spray paint remover products that you can just and then sort of makes them easily come off with a bit of spray of water as well. So this is my preference for how I like to have my paints in the paint palette, but each to their own. There is lots of ways of doing it. The next thing I wanted to touch on today is basically talking about what to start your Dot Mandala practice on. So as I mentioned, in our beginner kit, we do actually include some black cardstock. And this is just 250 GSM black cardstock, and it's really ideal for practice on. It can get sort of like a little bit warped when the paint is wet, but then it dries flat, so it's really good. Now, the thing is that, for dots themselves, it's not that big a deal to have a perfectly flat surface, but it is preferable. And one of the things that has become much more popular and integral to Dot Mandala Art is actually swoops and swashes and swishes and swipes and these sort of other more embellishments that we use, not just dots. And ideally for that, they do work better if you've got a completely perfectly flat surface. So what I mean by that is that this here is actually a piece of wooden board. It's actually called gesso board, and it's available from art shops. It's actually not particularly cheap, I don't find, or at least where I live, it's not cheap. But as you can see, it basically has this beautiful flat surface in it. I've put some black acrylic paint on this as a background paint. And it really is absolutely ideal. So painting on a wooden surface that's nice and flat with a fine surface is perfect. Other cheap things that you can get which are similar are, placemats from art and craft shops. Now, you can use canvas, but you can definitely use canvas. However, I just want to point out that, typically canvas is made with a bit of a coarse grain. I don't know how well you can see that. And I know doesn't look like it would be a problem. It's not too bad. But even that can actually just sort of make the edges of your dots and the edges of your swipes and your swooshes go a little bit sort of wonky as opposed to dotting on a perfectly flat surface. Now, of course, you can use sort of gessos, you can use, surface preps like that. You can use thick gessos, and they will help, but to be honest, they're a little bit fussy to use. Like often you have to sand between layers and things like that. So I suppose what I find is the easiest solution is to either find some card, some thick card, or wooden surfaces are ideal. And you can get these now online in different shapes and sizes and such as well. So this is what I'm doing today. As I said, this is a piece of gesso board. I could be doing it on the cardstock today. However, just for the sake of this video, it's sort of nice that it doesn't. This is nice and solid and it won't sort of flop around as I'm trying to teach. Just thought I would add this in when I was editing this video that might be helpful information. Talking about canvases again and how ideally you want a flat surface. This is actually a watercolour canvas panel. Now, it's not perfect because it's rectangle and that's an unusual shape for mandalas. More often we do them on square or circles, but it sort of has a much finer grain in the canvas, so that can be helpful. Watercolour canvases are available and they work really well for doing dot mandalas on. One more thing I wanted to mention before we finish up about, surfaces to dot on or canvases is that I always use a background paint. So whilst it's possible to get black cardstock and not card, but, canvas, ideally you still really want to paint it with a black paint or whatever background paint. It does not have to be black, but whatever background paint you're going to use, it's good to put a base coat down. And the reason for that is that when you make little mistakes, and of course we all do, you can easily clean up that spot. You clean up the wet paint in the sort of area you don't like immediately, whilst it's still wet, and you can clean it with sort of these little just a damp, Q-tip like this. You clean off as much as you can of the area, and then you let that dry, and then you can actually use some of the same background paint that you used, go over that area again with a little tiny touch-up brush, and of course redo that area. So in other words, you will never know that initial mistake happened. So that's one way that we can fix up mistakes. The next thing I wanted to talk about today is actually what you're going to use as a marker. So essentially what we're after is an erasable marker, and how we use this is we mark through the guidelines, as you'll see me do in a moment, and then we use those guidelines and we actually paint on those guidelines with our dots. Then when our art is completely dry, we're going to remove the guidelines just again with a little damp Q-tip or sort of like a little soft face wipe or something like that that's just had a little bit of water on it. And your guidelines should then come off, so you would never know that they're there. Now this one here is one that we provide at Happy Dotting Company. It's basically a soapstone style pencil and we find that really good. There can be a little bit of shadowing when you sort of initially remove it, but we find that by the time you actually put a sealer on it, you can't see it at all. There are different markers. Essentially, they all want to be erasable, but there are different markers that you can use. One option is like a watercolour pencil. And these are particularly good if you're working on, say, a white background. Like obviously the white marker that we provide is not going to show up on a white background or a background that's really pale like cream. So you really need a different colour. So these come in handy for that. You just got to make sure that it's completely water soluble. And then there's also some chalk pencils. But whatever erasable marker you use, it is best to test it on the background paint that you're using. So what I mean by that is that background paints can vary how much they will sort of allow you to erase the marker from them. The most troublesome background paint that I have heard of is actually the multi-surface. Now, the multi-surface has a little bit of gloss in it, and for some reason it is a bit resistant to actually seeing the marker on it. So I just use a matte black background paint, regular black background paint. Deco Art has one, it's just called Lamp Black Deco Art Americana. But Joe Songes just has a black, matte paint. But essentially anything that's sort of glossy can be problematic, but you just need to test the marker on it. So in other words, you're going to, test it like this and check that it actually shows up, and it does. And then equally, you want to test that it actually will rub off. So I've just dipped this in some water, and we're just going to rub that off and rub that off. And obviously that's still wet, but it has removed the line, and that's essentially what we're looking for in a marker. Okay, so we'll make a start. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just basically try and place this stencil and pop it in the middle of the board that I've got and draw through all the lines. Now, if you don't have a stencil, of course, you can just use a ruler and, go from corner to corner with your ruler. And then if you've got a compass, you can use your compass and draw some circles and use them as guidelines. But having a stencil, of course, makes it nice and handy. Voila, so that's the first step done. One thing I quite like to do is actually just sketch in these little bits here so that I've got that circle in the middle. So we're going to make a start, and I do need to just quickly talk about technique with the tools. So essentially, the dotting tools have a flat end, as even the superset does with the white set with the numbers. And what you want to do is hold the tool sort of close to the end, preferably have your wrist down so it's nice and supported. You want to hold the tool with the paint on it, so we're going to dip in the paint, and then you want to descend perpendicular. So in other words, you can't have the tool on an angle like that because it's not a pen. You do need to have the tool straight up and down, and then you paint down only very, very softly, so you only just make contact with the board and then come directly straight back up. So essentially that is the main technique with using dotting tools. The main mistake that people make is that they want to press the tool down. You've really got to resist pressing it down. You're only just making contact with the paint, and then getting consistent size dots with your paint. It comes with a sense of feel, what it feels like when the paint is actually touching the board, and essentially just practice.'t I do promise you consistency does come in a very short space of time. You just need to practice a little bit. So I'll show you what I mean. So we're going to use the green tool to start, and essentially I'm just aiming for the middle there. Now, if you're worried about using, if you're worried about hitting the centre, right in the centre, what you can do is actually start with a smaller tool, put that in the centre, and then if you find it slightly off, then use the bigger tool over the top. And that's really great, particularly with using the very big tools like that, because of course you can make bigger dots on top of existing dots, but you can't make smaller. So, that's pretty obvious to everyone, I think. Now, this tool I wouldn't say is particularly big, but we can, start in the centre there. with this one. I'm not too worried about that, but if it was a bigger tool, I might consider using a smaller tool first. So we're going to start with white. I'm just going to dip it in the paint, and as you can see, I'm not pressing down hard, just so that when I press it down, I see the paint sort of come to the edges. And essentially that looks pretty good to me. Actually, it is in the center, so that's all I need to do. And then I've got this wipe, or you can use kitchen paper, or you can just use a cloth, and essentially we're going to clean the paint off our tool, just like so. Now that's the first dot done. Now I'm going to use the red tool, and as I mentioned, I will actually be writing up this pattern and have it on have it as a download, a free download on our website. So if you want a printout of it to dot along to, then you're welcome to go to our website and download it for free. So the next one I'm going to use is this little red tool, and we're going to make our dots at, say, 12, 6, if you imagine this is a clock, 3, and then 9. And as you can see, again, I'm not pressing down hard. I'm only just making contact. And ideally, we don't want our dots to touch each other. We do want just a little bit of space between them. And you want to be moving your board around so that you can see where you're going. And there you go. So that's the first bit done. The next bit is I'm just going to put a tiny wee white dot with the stylus, the small end. This stylus you can hold at an angle, and we're just going to put a tiny white dot in between each of these. And as you can see, I've sort of got enough paint there that I can actually touch it twice, just being very, very soft and gentle, because I don't really want my dots to touch. And then again, I've just wiped off the paint off my stylus. I'm now going to use the blue tool, and I'm going to use the middle purple, and we're actually going to go in between the lines outside of the small white dot that we've just done. So I'll turn my work. So not pressing down hard. And as you can see, that paint consistency is working really well. I'm now going to use the darkest purple, and we're just going to go outside the white dot again. I'm just going to make sure I leave a little bit of gap here, because we're actually going to be doing some walking the dots around here. So as you can see, on these lines, essentially I'm aiming for the same position. Can you see that the top of the dot is just on that edge of the intersection there? And if I'm making that the same spot on each of these, then it should be consistent all the way around. I could just put a little bit more paint on that in the same one, just to fill it out a bit. You do need to sort of have a generous amount of paint on your tool. There we go. Again, wiping that. So you will have noticed that I'm pretty much dipping in the paint every single time, except sometimes when I'm using the stylus. So I'm just going to let that dry a little bit, and then we're going to actually be walking the dots around these bigger dots that we've just made. So next up, I'm going to be a little technique called walking the dots, and essentially what that means is that we're going to be dipping our stylus into the paint, and then we're going to be dotting around, walking the dots around these dots that are bigger dots that I've just done until we run out of paint, and it creates this lovely sort of tapered effect when you're doing it, and it's really quite fun to do. Now we do this with a stylus. In the beginner kit, this is the stylus that it has, and it has a 1.5mm end and a 3mm end. You can use either end, but with this one, because there's not a lot of space, we're just going to use the small end. With the stylus, you can hold it at an angle because, as you can see, the ends are actually rounded, and we're just going to be dotting around like that. Another very popular tool that we do have at Happy Dotting Company is actually these stylus here. And for the first time, we're actually going to be having these 3 stylus sets that actually have the sizes on them as well. So as you can see there, and this particular set has a nice fine one. So I'm excited to be able to provide these in the very near future. It should be any day now on our Happy Dotting www.happydottingcompany.com site. So that's very exciting. But for now, we're going to use this one, which works perfectly fine. And what we're going to do is I'm going to dip in the paint here, and I'm going to start on the line because that's obviously in the middle. And we're just going to start there. And what we're aiming to do is have our dots close together, following around the circle, but not have them touching. When we dip again, we can actually just dot again in the same spot, and it just makes that first dot slightly bigger, and then we go around the other side. Again, have them close together but not actually touching, and just following around that edge. Try and position yourself so that you can actually see what you're doing. Turn your art as you go. So that's essentially what it should look like. We're now going to be putting just a little dot of the light turquoise in between these ones, and I'm actually just going to dip in there, and I'm just going to do it 1 dot there and then 1 dot there. Actually, I can make this one just a bit rounder there. So I'm just going to be, basically doing some dotting now, and I'll put some music on. And then when we come to doing the swipes, I'll be discussing the best technique for them. this next bit we're going to be doing some swipes. So we're actually going to be going from here down to here. And I've just smoothed the angle of my camera so hopefully you can have a better look. But essentially what we do is I'm going to use the lighter purple and start from here and just go down. And you can see that I'm pushing the paint down with my stylus. But once I get to about there, I'm only doing one movement. And essentially you can't keep going over the end part of it and expect it to end up fine at the end. So initially I am manipulating it down, sort of pushing it down, and then just one action. So this first layer is now dry. I've been let that drying for quite a few hours. And now we're going to do some top dots. It's at this stage that if you weren't happy with the shape of some of your, swooshes, one little trick that people often do is they'll use a marker. So this is a very fine tip marker, and it's a permanent ink waterproof marker. You could actually sort of neaten up the swooshes with this if you've got a black background and you're using a black marker. And I think the ones that I've done now look absolutely fine, but it is a little trick that, particularly when you're learning, it's hard to get these little strokes sort of looking perfect. So, like I said, this layer is dry. You do have to wait until it's dry. Otherwise, when you put the next layer of paint on, it can basically sort of pull it off if it's still wet. So we're just going to use the little blue tool and go over these dots in a different colour, and it just adds some, dimension to the work. Now just going to do the third layer of dots just on some, and it just gives it a really nice dynamic. Now that this layer is dry, I'm just going to be removing the guidelines now with this little Q-tip that's just dipped in water, and we just gently rub away these guideline marks. Now that this is all dry, I'm going to spray this with some picture varnish. So this is a satin, which I find really good for this type of work. So it gives it a little bit of sheen, but not too much gloss. So that's the end of our tutorial today. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you've found this inspiring to give it a go, or if you've started, maybe it's helped address any issues that you might have had. So we have lots of other videos on our Happy Dotting Company YouTube channel, as well as our website. You will see a discount coupon link to our website below. And, please reach out to us if you have any problems or anything that we can help with. Bye.